Long before anyone saw it with their own eyes, the Halworth system was already famous for one reason. On every star chart made by the Concord, the biggest group of star nations in the galaxy, this system carried a single word next to its name: dead. No explanation, no history, just that one word, and a quiet rule that no ship should go there. For hundreds of years, most species listened to that rule. Traders steered around it. Explorers marked it as a waste of fuel. Even pirates, who broke almost every other law in the galaxy, left Halworth alone. A system with no reason attached to its warning made people nervous in a way that a real threat never could. Humans were newer to this part of the galaxy, and newer people tend to ask more questions. When scans showed that Halworth's star was healthy, its planets were intact, and its asteroid belts were full of rare minerals worth more than entire fleets, the United Systems Navy decided the old warning was probably just an old mistake. Nobody could find a single record explaining what had gone wrong there. So they decided to go find out for themselves. The first ship chosen for the job was the UES Solace, a mid-sized survey vessel built for mapping unknown space, not for fighting. Its captain was a man named Owen Hale, a steady officer known for finishing jobs quietly and on time. His crew liked him because he never pretended a mission was more dangerous than it was, and he never pretended it was safer either. On the morning the Solace left port, nobody threw a big celebration. There were no speeches. A dock worker waved at Hale from a loading crane and shouted a joke about bringing back souvenirs from a cursed system, and Hale laughed and told him to keep a drink cold for their return. That was the whole send-off. The trip to Halworth took 11 days. During that time, the crew ran their usual checks, played cards in the mess hall, and joked about the old warning label the way people joke about ghost stories they don't quite believe. Hale kept a private log where he wrote down his honest thoughts each night. In one entry, he wrote that the system felt like nothing more than an old rumor that had outlived the reason for its own existence. When the Solace finally crossed into Halworth space, the sensors found nothing strange at first. No wreckage, no radiation spikes, no sign of a war, a plague, or an accident. Just a calm yellow star, 3 rocky planets, and asteroid fields glittering with minerals nobody had ever touched. The crew began their survey work, marking safe paths for future mining ships, cataloging resources, taking pictures for the record. For 9 hours, everything went exactly the way a normal mission should go. Then, without warning, all outgoing transmissions from the Solace stopped in the middle of a routine report. Hale had been reading numbers off a scanner to his communications officer, and his sentence simply ended mid-word. No static, no distress signal, no final scream over the radio. The feed just went quiet, as if someone had reached out and turned it off. Back at Navy Command, nobody noticed right away. It took almost 2 full days before anyone realized the scheduled check-in from the Solace had never arrived. When a communications officer finally flagged the silence, the file landed on the desk of Captain Dana Ruiz, a fleet officer known for reading every report twice before she signed off on it. Ruiz pulled up the last data burst the Solace had sent, the one recorded seconds before the signal died. She played it more than a dozen times. There was nothing dramatic in it. No alarms, no warning of danger. Just Hale's calm voice reading numbers that suddenly stopped mid-sentence. That silence bothered her more than any scream would have. She brought the recording to First Officer Aldo Kessler, a careful man who liked facts more than guesses. Kessler watched the short clip twice and told her the simplest explanation was equipment failure, maybe a total power loss that had taken out every system at once, including the black box. Ruiz didn't buy it. A total power failure that took out every backup system, every emergency beacon, and every recorder all at the same second, with no warning at all, was not simple. It was too clean, too complete, as if something had reached in and switched the entire ship off like a light. She asked her superiors for permission to send a second ship, a smaller one, just to look at what was left. Her request was met with the same tired argument she had heard before. The system had been marked dead for a reason, and maybe humans finally understood what that reason was. Ruiz refused to accept that answer. She had read the Solace's final log entries, Hale's private notes about souvenirs and jokes, and calm yellow stars. Somewhere in that quiet system, a crew of people who had trusted the Navy to bring them home was either dead or waiting to be found. She was not willing to write them off as a lesson learned. After 3 days of arguing through channels she barely had patience for, Ruiz finally got what she wanted. A single follow-up ship, the US Meridian, would be sent into Halworth, this time with clear orders to move carefully, record everything, and turn back at the first sign of real danger. Ruiz wasn't given command of it. That decision, made by officers who outranked her, would end up mattering more than anyone expected. But she did manage to get 2 people she trusted assigned to the crew, a sharp young engineer named Priya Nair and a pilot with more nerve than sense named Faradose. As the Meridian prepared to launch, Ruiz stood at the edge of the docking bay and watched it go, thinking about a sentence that had simply stopped in the middle of a number and a system that had been called dead by everyone who never bothered to ask why. Some journeys begin with excitement. The one Priya Nair found herself on began with a checklist. Before the US Meridian even left port, she had gone through every system on the ship twice, then a third time out of habit. She was not a nervous person by nature, but the story of what happened to the Solace had stuck with her the way certain stories do, quietly, in the back of the mind, refusing to be filed away and forgotten. She had never met Owen Hale, but she had read his final log entries the way everyone on the crew had, and something about a sentence that simply stopped had bothered her more than any dramatic account of disaster ever could. Faradose, the Meridian's newest pilot, felt differently. He was young enough to think danger was mostly a matter of paying attention and confident enough to believe he was very good at paying attention. He had asked for this assignment personally, partly because flying a survey ship into a system marked dead sounded far more interesting than another routine cargo run, and partly because he liked being the person other people worried about. The Meridian's orders were simple on paper. Enter the system carefully. Follow a mapped, predictable path. Record everything. Turn back at the first sign of real trouble. In practice, following those orders meant hours of slow, careful movement while sensors scanned every inch of space ahead of them. And Nair sat at her console cross-checking every reading against what little data the Solace had managed to send before it vanished. For the first 2 days inside Halworth space, nothing happened. The star burned calm and yellow. The planet sat quiet and untouched. The crew began to relax in the way people do when caution starts to feel like overreaction. Ose made jokes about the system's reputation being nothing more than an old story that refused to die. Even Nair allowed herself to believe, just a little, that the Solace had suffered a normal accident after all. On the 3rd day, her instruments told a different story. While running a routine scan of the outer asteroid belt, Nair noticed a strange reading near a cluster of rocks that should have been completely empty. According to every sensor on the ship, that patch of space held nothing at all. And yet something in that emptiness pulled at the Meridian's instruments the way a heavy object pulls at a scale, bending readings that had no business bending. She checked the numbers twice, then a 3rd time, then called the ship's commander over to look for himself. The commander, cautious by training and by nature, decided the anomaly was worth a closer look, but not worth risking the whole ship. He ordered a single shuttle sent out to investigate from a safe distance, and Ose, unsurprisingly, volunteered before anyone else could speak. Nair argued against it. She didn't like the readings, and she liked them even less the longer she stared at them. But orders were orders, and Ose was already climbing into the shuttle before her objection finished leaving her mouth. The shuttle's short flight toward the anomaly was uneventful at first. Ose kept up a steady stream of commentary over the comm channel, describing the empty patch of space ahead of him as if narrating a rather dull documentary. Then, without warning, his voice changed. He had found something. Small pieces of metal, floating in a loose cluster, catching the starlight in a way empty rock never did. As he moved closer, the shapes became clearer and clearer still, until there was no mistaking what he was looking at. Hull fragments, pieces of a ship, and stitched into one twisted piece of metal, still faintly visible, part of a name that everyone on the Meridian recognized immediately. Solace. The fragments were completely intact where they floated, untouched by explosion or fire, as if someone had carefully placed them there rather than a disaster tearing them apart. That detail alone was enough to make Nair's stomach turn. Ships that suffer accidents don't leave their wreckage so carefully arranged. Ose's voice grew tighter as he described the scene, and then, mid-sentence, his transmission began breaking apart into static. A short, garbled burst of audio reached the Meridian just before the connection cut out completely. Nobody could make out full words in that burst, only fragments, and a tone in Osei's voice that sounded less like fear and more like confusion, as if he were listening to something rather than seeing it. Then his signal vanished. Not faded. Vanished. The same clean, complete silence the Solace's crew had gone into 2 months earlier. The Meridian systems began failing seconds later, in exactly the pattern the Solace had reported in its own final moments. Backup power flickered. Communication stuttered. For a handful of terrifying seconds, it seemed the ship itself was about to disappear the same way the shuttle had. The commander made the only call he could. He ordered the Meridian to reverse course immediately and burn every bit of fuel necessary to get clear of Halworth space before whatever was happening finished happening to them too. The ship shook as it tore away from the system, alarms screaming through every corridor, systems flickering on and off in a fight to stay alive. They made it out. Barely. The Meridian limped back to Navy territory with half its systems damaged and 1 crew member missing, carrying nothing solid to explain what had happened, only a short, broken recording of Farid Osei's final transmission. Back at command, Dana Ruiz listened to that recording more times than she could count. Beneath the static, buried in the noise, there was a moment where Osei's voice went strangely calm, as if he were answering a question nobody else could hear. It was not the voice of a man in danger. It was the voice of a man being spoken to. Not every important battle is fought with weapons. Some are won by asking a single question nobody else had bothered to ask. That question came from Grace Whitfield, a xenolinguist attached to the Navy specifically to handle communication with the Concord, the alliance of older, more established species that had been watching humanity's rise with a mixture of curiosity and caution. After the Meridian limped home, missing a pilot and carrying nothing but a broken recording, the Concord sent its own representative to formally warn humanity away from Halworth for good. That representative was Talar's son, an Australi diplomat with decades of experience managing exactly this kind of situation. His species had been part of the Concord long before humans had even developed reliable spaceflight, and he approached the meeting the way he approached most things involving young species, with patience, a little pity, and full confidence that he already knew how the conversation would end. He explained, in the calm, practiced tone of someone who had given this speech many times before, that Halworth had been correctly classified as dead centuries ago, and that humanity's recent losses only confirmed what the Concord had known all along. He recommended, formally and firmly, that all further activity in the system cease immediately. Whitfield listened to the entire explanation without interrupting. When Talar finished, she asked the one question his prepared speech had never actually answered. What, exactly, had happened there to earn that classification in the first place? Talar paused. It was a small pause, barely noticeable, but Whitfield had spent years learning to read hesitation across different species, and she caught it immediately. He explained, a little less smoothly than before, that the original cause had been lost to time, that records from that era were incomplete, and that the classification itself was old enough to predate detailed record-keeping. Whitfield pressed harder. She asked whether Halworth was the only system in Concord records with such an incomplete explanation attached to a permanent warning. Talar's answer, after another pause, was no. There were others. Not many, but enough to notice a pattern if someone actually looked for one. She kept pulling at that thread until Talar finally admitted something the Concord did not advertise. Halworth had never been marked dead because of any confirmed danger. It had been marked dead because every serious expedition sent there, by every species that had tried, ended the same way. Ships vanished. Some crew members were occasionally recovered, confused and unharmed but missing time. Most were simply never seen again. After enough failures, older species had stopped trying and eventually stopped explaining why, because admitting the full truth meant admitting they had given up looking for their own people. That single admission changed everything for Dana Ruiz, who had been listening from the next room the entire time. If Halworth wasn't simply dangerous, if it was something closer to a filter, quietly testing every visitor and only occasionally letting anyone leave, then the crews of the Solace and the Meridian's shuttle might not be dead at all. They might still be waiting. Ruiz took that idea straight to Navy Command, along with a full transcript of Talar's admission. She argued that Halworth deserved one more mission, not a cautious probe like the last two, but a real task force with the resources to actually reach whatever was pulling ships in and figure out what it wanted. Her superiors were reluctant. The Concorde's warning, even with its shaky history, still carried weight, and losing a third ship would be difficult to justify to the public. Ruiz made her argument personal instead of political. She reminded them that Owen Hale and Faradose were still officially listed as missing, not dead, and that the Navy had a long-standing principle of not writing people off while there was still a reasonable chance of finding them. She pointed out that if the pattern Taller described was accurate, other species had given up looking specifically because it was easier than admitting failure. She was not interested in repeating that mistake. It took 3 more days of argument, but Command finally approved a full task force under Ruiz's direct command. The flagship would be the UES Wayfinder, a heavier vessel with real defensive capability, crewed by people Ruiz had chosen herself. Although Kessler would serve as her second in command, Priya Nair, still shaken but determined, would lead the engineering team. Grace Whitfield would come along to handle whatever communication challenges appeared next. Tallerson requested, somewhat to Ruiz's surprise, to join the mission as an official Concorde observer. Officially, his purpose was to document what would surely be humanity's third failure in Halworth space, adding one more entry to the Concorde's quiet, unspoken pattern. Privately, though something in his manner had shifted since his conversation with Whitfield, and Ruiz suspected his curiosity had started to outweigh his certainty. The Wayfinder left port without speeches or celebration, the same quiet send-off the Solace had received months earlier, except this time nobody joked about souvenirs. The journey to Halworth took 10 days. When the task force finally crossed into the system, sensors immediately picked up the same strange gravitational reading the Meridian had found near the outer asteroid belt. The empty patch of space that pulled at instruments like something enormous was hiding inside it. This time, however, it wasn't hiding quietly. As the Wayfinder's sensors locked onto the anomaly, the empty space around it began to shift, folding open like a door built into the fabric of the system itself, revealing something none of them had been prepared to see. Priya Nair had walked into a lot of strange places during her years in engineering, cargo holds flooded with radiation, reactor rooms hot enough to cook a meal on the floor, but none of them had ever felt quite like this. The moment the anomaly opened, the Wayfinder was pulled forward, gently but firmly, the way a leaf gets pulled toward a drain. Dana Ruiz gave the order not to fight it. Fighting, she reasoned, was probably exactly what had gotten the Solace and the Meridian shuttle into trouble in the first place. Instead, she let the ship be drawn in, bracing for an impact that never came. What waited on the other side was not open space at all. It was the inside of something enormous, a structure so vast that the Wayfinder's sensors struggled to find its edges. There were no visible walls in the traditional sense, only soft, shifting light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and a silence so complete that even the ship's own engines sounded muffled inside it. Ruiz assembled a small team to investigate on foot, choosing Nair for her engineering knowledge, Kessler for his steady judgment, and Whitfield in case communication became necessary. Tallerson insisted on joining them as well, his earlier confidence about documenting a third human failure now replaced with something closer to genuine curiosity. The team moved carefully through corridors that didn't feel built so much as grown, curved and seamless, without a single visible joint or seam. The deeper they went, the more the light shifted color, from a pale white to a soft gold that reminded Nair, oddly, of late afternoon sunlight back home. They found the missing crews in a wide chamber near the structure's center. Dozens of figures, human and otherwise, suspended in what looked like fields of soft, glowing light, floating gently a few inches off the ground. Nair recognized Owen Hale immediately from his official photo, his expression calm, almost peaceful, as if he were simply asleep. Nearby floated Faradose, one hand still curled as though he had been reaching for something the moment he was taken. None of them appeared harmed. Their chests rose and fell with slow, steady breathing. But no amount of scanning or manual effort could free them from whatever field held them suspended. Nair tried every trick she knew, adjusting frequencies, testing for weak points, running diagnostics that told her everything and nothing at once. The field simply would not respond to anything she attempted. It was Whitfield who noticed the change first, a subtle shift in the light around them, followed by a presence that none of them could quite locate with their eyes, but all of them somehow felt. It did not announce itself with sound. Instead, thoughts arranged themselves in each of their minds with startling clarity, not words exactly, but meaning delivered directly, the way a familiar smell can bring back a memory without a single word being spoken. The team began calling it the Warden, since it offered no name of its own. It explained, patiently and without any hostility, that it had been left behind by a civilization long since gone, tasked with a single purpose: to identify a species capable of receiving what remained of that civilization's knowledge, stored deep within the structure. Every visitor who entered Halworth's space was, without realizing it, being tested. The Warden showed them, through the same wordless method of communication, fragments of history from countless earlier attempts. Other species, some the humans had heard of, others completely unknown, had entered this same structure over the centuries. Each had faced a series of trials meant to reveal whether they were ready for what the vault held. And each, eventually, had failed the same way. When faced with difficult choices, they had left crew members behind to save time, sacrificed teammates to save themselves, or simply given up and turned back once the cost grew too high. The Warden did not judge them harshly for this. It explained, in that same calm, patient tone, that failure was simply information, and that every failed attempt was recorded and allowed to leave, memory of the experience quietly erased so as not to disturb the wider galaxy with knowledge it wasn't ready for. Over time, word spread among the surviving species anyway, not of what had actually happened, but of ships that entered Halworth and never returned. Eventually, the Concord simply marked the system dead and stopped sending anyone at all, without ever admitting the real reason why. Tallerson stood frozen through this entire explanation, his earlier confidence completely gone. 6 centuries of Concord history, an entire warning built into every star chart he had ever studied, had never been about danger at all. It had been about failure, quietly hidden behind a single convenient word so that no species ever had to admit they had left their own people behind. Ruiz asked the only question that mattered to her. Could the missing crews be freed? The Warden's answer was simple. Yes, but only if the current visitors succeeded where every other visitor before them had failed. It explained that Ruiz's own team was now undergoing the same trial that had claimed every previous crew, and that the true test had very little to do with strength, weapons, or cleverness. It was a test of whether they would hold on to every member of their own team when the structure inevitably offered them an easier path that required leaving someone behind. The chamber's light shifted once more, gold deepening into something closer to amber, as the Warden's presence pulled back slightly, leaving Ruiz and her team standing among dozens of floating, sleeping strangers, with a choice ahead of them that no other species had ever managed to make correctly. The first choice came less than 10 minutes into the trial, and it looked, at first, like nothing more than a simple fork in a hallway. The corridor leading deeper into the structure split into 2 paths. One was short and clearly safe, sloping gently downward toward what looked like the stasis chamber, holding Owen Hale, Fardo Say, and the rest of the missing crews. The other path was longer, narrower, and visibly unstable, sections of the floor flickering in and out like a signal struggling to hold its shape. A soft, wordless suggestion arrived in each of their minds at the same moment, the same calm presence they had come to recognize as the Warden. The short path, it explained, would take one member of the team out of the trial entirely, safely, painlessly, and permanently. The remaining team would reach the stasis chamber faster and with less risk. Nobody moved at first. Then Aldo Kessler, always the practical one, pointed out quietly that speed mattered. Every extra minute they spent inside the structure was a minute where something could go wrong, a minute where the whole team might end up trapped instead of just one person. It wasn't cruelty in his voice, only cold calculation, the same kind of thinking that had kept him alive through years of careful, cautious decisions. Dana Ruiz didn't answer him with an argument. She simply started walking down the longer, unstable path, and after a moment, everyone else followed, including Kessler, who said nothing more about it but stayed close to Nair for the rest of the walk. The path lived up to its warning. Sections of floor gave way without notice, forcing the team to leap gaps that appeared and disappeared in the same breath. At one point, Grace Whitfield's foot caught on an edge that vanished as she stepped on it, and only Tallerson's quick reach kept her from falling into a gap none of them could see the bottom of. It was the first time in the entire mission that a Concord official had physically intervened to help a human, rather than simply observing and recording. Further in, the structure offered a second choice, more difficult than the first. A section of corridor collapsed entirely, leaving a gap too wide to jump, with a narrow, exposed maintenance shaft as the only alternative. The shaft was clearly built for something smaller than a person, and clearly not built to hold weight for long. The warden's presence suggested, gently as always, that one team member could remain behind at a nearby control point to stabilize the path for the others, a suggestion that sounded reasonable until they realized the stabilization would take longer than anyone could safely wait, effectively trading one life for the group's continued progress. This time, it was Priya Nair who refused to accept the offered solution as the only option. She studied the collapsed section for a long moment, then pulled apart a piece of equipment from her own pack, rewiring it with quick, practiced hands into a makeshift support brace. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't something she had ever tested before, but it held long enough for the entire team to cross together, one at a time, with Nair steadying the brace the whole way through and refusing to cross herself until everyone else was safely on the other side. Kessler, watching her do this, said nothing, but something in his expression had changed by the time they regrouped on solid ground. The trials continued like this for what felt like hours, though none of them could say for certain how much time had actually passed inside the structure. Each obstacle offered a shortcut, and every shortcut required leaving someone behind, weakening the team, or sacrificing safety for speed. Each time, the team found another way through together, sometimes barely, always at a cost of time and effort, but never at the cost of a single person. When they finally reached the stasis chamber a second time, exhausted and battered but whole, the warden's presence returned, calmer now, almost curious. It told them, without any dramatic announcement, that the trial had technically already been passed. They had reached the chamber without leaving anyone behind, something no previous team from any species had managed to do. The stasis fields, it explained, were ready to release. Ruiz didn't move to extract anyone right away. Instead, she asked Nair to run a full manual count of every person in the chamber, cross-checking each face against the Solace and Meridian's original crew manifests, one at a time, out loud, in front of everyone. It took nearly 20 extra minutes the warden had already indicated were unnecessary, but Ruiz insisted on it anyway. She was not willing to release anyone until she was completely certain every single person from both missing crews was accounted for and awake, not just the ones the trial had technically required her to save. When Nair finished the count and confirmed that every name matched a face, Ruiz gave the order to begin releasing the stasis fields. The light in the chamber shifted as the first field dissolved, gold deepening into a warm, glowing amber that spread outward across the entire ceiling, far beyond the small area where the team stood. For the first time since they had entered the structure, the warden's presence addressed not just Ruiz alone, but the entire team at once, its wordless voice carrying something that felt, for the first time, close to genuine surprise. Owen Hale woke up thinking only a few minutes had passed. The last thing he remembered clearly was reading a set of scanner numbers aloud to his communications officer, somewhere in the calm, quiet space of the Halworth system. Now he was lying on a soft, glowing surface, staring up at a ceiling made of light instead of metal, with absolutely no memory of anything that had happened in between. When he sat up, disoriented, and saw Dana Ruiz standing nearby with an expression somewhere between relief and exhaustion, he understood immediately that far more than a few minutes had passed. One by one, the rest of the missing crew members woke the same way, confused, unharmed, and missing most of the time they had spent inside the structure. Farid Osei woke reaching for a shuttle console that wasn't there, blinked several times, and asked, with surprising calm for someone who had just spent months trapped inside an ancient vault, whether anyone had kept his seat warm. There were tears, quiet ones mostly, exchanged between people who had given up hope of ever seeing familiar faces again. Kessler, never one for emotional displays, found himself gripping Osei's shoulder longer than strictly necessary before letting go and clearing his throat as though nothing had happened. Once the reunion settled into something calmer, the warden's presence returned, addressing the entire group together rather than Ruiz alone, as it had at the end of the trial. It explained, in that same patient, wordless way, that what remained deeper inside the structure was now open to them. Centuries of knowledge and technology, left behind by a civilization that no longer existed, had been sealed away specifically for whichever visitors proved they valued the lives of their own people over the convenience of leaving someone behind. No species before humanity had passed that test. The vault, it said simply, had been waiting a very long time. It made clear that none of it had ever been meant as a prize to be taken by force or stumbled upon by accident. It was meant as an inheritance, offered only to those who had earned it the hard way, through choices made when no one was watching to judge them except the structure itself. Talar's son, still visibly shaken by everything he had witnessed, made a request of his own. He asked Ruiz's permission to record everything, the trial, the warden's explanation, the true history behind Halworth's classification, so that he could bring it back to the Concord himself. His original mission had been to document a third human failure. Instead, he intended to correct 600 years of quiet, convenient dishonesty, forcing his own government to admit how many other crews from how many other species had likely been written off the same way, simply because admitting failure was harder than inventing a warning label. Ruiz agreed without hesitation. If the truth was going to change anything, it needed to come from someone the Concord would actually listen to, and that meant Talar telling it in his own voice, not humans forcing it onto them from the outside. The journey home took the same 10 days it had taken to arrive, though it felt shorter to everyone aboard, filled as it was with recovered crew members slowly readjusting to solid meals, real conversations, and the strange comfort of familiar faces. Nair spent much of the trip quietly rebuilding parts of the shuttle system's damage during the trials, partly out of habit, partly because working with her hands helped her process everything that had happened. By the time the Wayfinder reached home, word of what had happened in Halworth had already begun to spread, carried ahead by a short summary Ruiz had transmitted the moment they cleared the system. The story that reached human space was not one of danger successfully survived, but something stranger and more hopeful. An ancient system, wrongly labeled dead for centuries, had actually been waiting for someone worthy enough to wake it up. The Concord's reaction took longer, delayed by exactly the kind of careful, cautious deliberation Talar had once represented so perfectly. But eventually, with his own testimony leading the way, the official Concord archive entry for the Halworth system was updated. The single word that had sat there for 600 years, dead, was struck from the record. In its place, a new designation appeared, one the Concord had never needed to use before, marking Halworth not as a graveyard, but as a threshold successfully crossed. Ruiz, Kessler, Nair, Whitfield, Osei, and Hale returned to ordinary duties eventually, though none of them ever spoke about the mission quite the same way people usually spoke about difficult assignments. There was no boasting in it, no exaggerated stories told over drinks. Mostly there was a quiet understanding among all of them that the real test had never been about strength or cleverness at all. It had been about something far simpler and far harder to fake, refusing to leave anyone behind, even when every easier option pointed the other way. Months later, in a quiet Concord archive office far from human space, Talarson sat finishing his official report on the incident, the cursor blinking at the end of a long, careful explanation of centuries of hidden failure. Before submitting it, he added one final line of his own, unofficial and unnecessary, the kind of note that wouldn't normally belong in a formal record at all. Maybe, he wrote, the system was never really dead. Maybe it had simply been waiting for someone worth waking up for.